My name is Cecilia, and I'm the media coordinator at IATP. And today I'm joined by Ben Lilliston and Tara Ritter, who are here with us to discuss a new report out by the House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis. And the report is titled Solving the Climate Crisis, the Congressional Action Plan for a Clean Energy Economy and a Healthy, Resilient, and Just America. So I'm going to turn it over to Tara first and then Ben to introduce themselves to our audience that is with us here today.
Sure. Hi, I'm Tara Ritter. I'm a senior program associate at IATP working on climate change and rural communities, and so focus a lot of my work on the intersection of climate and agriculture policy.
I'm Ben Lilliston. I'm director of our Climate and Rural Strategies program at IATP. And so look a lot at national level policy, but also some international policy and how it intersects with agriculture and climate, sort of that point of intersection on those two. And very excited to be talking a little bit about this House Climate Report because we've been tracking this issue and this intersection of these two issues for probably over a decade. And this is sort of a big development in the discussions around very hard and sometimes difficult and challenging discussions about this intersection of climate and agriculture.
Great. Thank you. So as a reminder to everyone, please feel free to leave any questions you might have for either Tara or Ben in the comment section of this video throughout our conversation, and we'll take a few minutes at the end today to address those questions. So first and foremost, I'm hoping you can give a little background on what this House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis is. I know that I wasn't familiar with this committee before learning about it from the two of you. So if someone could just jump in and share a little bit of information about what this committee is, who it's comprised of, and what its goals are, that would be great.
I can start and then Ben can fill in anything I left out. But the committee was created early last year, so early in 2019, and it was largely a response to the national conversation around a Green New Deal. So there was a lot of conversation about climate policy and sweeping reform, and the Green New Deal was getting a lot of different responses from people desiring bold climate action, but on the other side was facing pretty severe backlash. So this committee was created within the House of Representatives by Nancy Pelosi and was charged with putting together climate policy recommendations for Congress. So importantly, the committee doesn't have any authority to pass legislation. They were just tasked with putting together a set of recommendations, which is what this report is. The committee is, I think, 15 representatives, so 9 Democrats and 6 Republicans. And the report that we're talking about today was authored just by the Democrats on the committee. And Ben, I don't know what else you would fill in there.
Well, I think that I would just add that the significance of the committee is that it's really taking a comprehensive look at the challenge of climate change. So not just narrow by a specific committee, like have the Ag Committee look at it or the Energy Committee look at it, but looking at it in its entirety and how it affects so many parts of our policy framework and our society, our economy, and thinking about how those parts fit together. And I think it in some ways, I think, can be seen as a roadmap for 2021 if the political environment in the US shifts and there is an opportunity to really pass climate legislation. And we urgently need to. The US is really getting more and more isolated around the world in terms of not having a national level climate policy. We don't have one. Other countries do. So we need to get moving. And this is I think a pretty big step forward in really grappling with the enormity of the challenge, but also the possibility and how this could really work in a very positive way for many parts of our country.
Yeah. So Tara, I think you mentioned that the 9 Democrats on the committee authored the report. Are the remaining 6 Republicans on the committee also going to come out with their own report, or was this kind of the ultimate result of this project of the committee?
I have not heard anything about the Republicans authoring their own report. So as far as I know, this is it.
Okay, got it. And I know oftentimes here in the United States, at least, agriculture is left out of climate policy proposals. Does agriculture have a place in this report that came out?
Yes, it does. So the report has a full agriculture chapter, and I'm sure
Okay.
as we get into the questions later, we can dive into some of the content on that.
Perfect. Wonderful. Well, earlier this week, we published an article on our website that kind of details out where we think the report is particularly successful or where it falls short of what's actually needed. And I'll link to that article in the comment section here now. But maybe, Ben, you can start by sharing some of the more positive elements of the report that we at IATP really liked.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things it does is talk a lot about resilience and adaptation. And that's something that's often, it's not like super sexy when you think about climate policy. People are really focused, of course, as they should, on reducing emissions, but we need to deal with adaptation and resilience. And it's really critical for rural communities that are sort of natural resource based, and communities dealing with infrastructure that's aging and struggling, and we're going to see more extreme weather events. We already are. So that emphasis, I think, is really welcome. They're putting together a national climate adaptation program, or suggesting that. It talks a lot about climate justice, which is also something that has not been at the center of climate policy in the past. And I think as this movement for climate change evolves, it's becoming clearer and clearer that some communities are more affected by not only climate change itself, but also climate policy, disproportionately affected. And it's a lot of communities of color. We see that in agriculture, around where big CAFOs are cited, and who's dealing with water pollution and who's dealing with air pollution. You also see that in the emission side, sort of the energy sector and so forth. So this report, it really openly acknowledges that, integrates climate justice considerations throughout, has a dedicated pillar, they call it a pillar, on climate justice. So I think that's a pretty big step forward. It includes protections for farm workers, something that also has often been sidestepped, and there is no national level sort of consideration about the rise in heat and for outdoor workers in general, and how to deal with that and make sure that their health is protected. And then there's a commitment to sort of re-engage the world. You know, there's been a lot of damage done to the United States standing internationally with the Trump administration, and pulling out of the Paris Climate Agreement is, I think, one of those places where we've lost a lot of standing. And this recommits to the Paris Climate Agreement, but also recommits to funding international, like the Green Climate Fund and other international efforts that really require global cooperation if we're going to deal with climate change.
That's great. So I know that we submitted a comment, correct, leading up to the creation of this report. So what was the process for developing these pillars of the report? Did they get insight from groups like IATP, conduct interviews? How did they go about creating this report and coming up with these pillars?
One thing that the committee did was, throughout the year-long process, they held a lot of hearings, and the hearings were all on different topics. So there was an agriculture hearing back in October where they had some people testify about what they were thinking. there's pros and cons to that. On the one hand, they're only hearing from, a few select people giving testimony. But then again, this entire comment process was open and allowed a broader swath of people to weigh in. And like you said, we did submit comments.
They met with a lot of people one-on-one too, a lot of groups, and including ITP, we were able to meet with their staff. And I think that brings up, one of their last pillars, their last recommendations is the importance of stakeholder engagement in this climate policy. In other words, we really need to understand and hear from people how they are affected and how some of these policies are going to affect their lives. Tara has led a lot of a series of rural climate dialogues in Minnesota that we've done that just point to how important that is, to be able to create space to have conversations about, okay, what are we going to do around water? What are we going to do around soil? What are we going to do around energy? And so I think that was a good part of this report, but that recommendation is really critical going forward. The top-down solutions without really hearing and understanding the implications of them has been a big problem, I think, in climate policy in the past.
Definitely. So were there any elements of the comments that we submitted that were integrated into the final report, or any elements that we thought were very key and important that were left out of the report?
I can start just thinking, again, when Ben was talking about the list of things that we liked in the report, there were some really key agriculture pillars that most of the agriculture section was underpinned by two bills, which was Shelley Pingree's Agriculture Resilience Act, and then a bill by Cory Booker that, Ben, what was the name of the bill?
I think it's the Climate Security Act.
Climate Security Act. And a lot of IATP's recommendations made it into Shelley Pingree's Agriculture Resilience Act. And so that was very exciting to see that underpinning the report. There's a really strong focus on soil health, so increasing funding for a suite of conservation programs. The Conservation Stewardship Program is one of those, and we've written about that. Basically, it supplies incentives and cost sharing for farmers to implement conservation practices on their land. It's been just historically over-enrolled and underfunded, and so putting a lot more public support into that was something that we were very excited about. And then similarly, the report does look at transitioning away from factory farms. And, a lot of that includes investing in an alternative manure management program and taking away some public support within those conservation programs from CAFOs. So again, a lot of our ag recommendations did make it in. We were really excited to see that. And there were some other pieces too, tying conservation to crop insurance, expanding research for climate and ag programs. And yeah, a lot of that made it in. So the ag section, by and large, I think we were very supportive of, and really was, included a lot of what we had to say in our comments.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I'm glad to hear that so many of our proposals were incorporated into the report.
And I think there were some other pieces that did as well that maybe Ben can speak to aside from the ag section.
Perfect.
Yeah, I would add, aside from a few things that we already mentioned around farm worker protection, emphasis on adaptation, some of the climate justice issues. They also include the need for greater climate risk disclosure for companies, public companies, through the SEC. And that's something that we have been digging into for several years. We'll actually have a report coming out probably in the next month or so about climate risk and financial institutions and how they intersect with agriculture, including farm credit. So there was a good step forward on that. And I think there's starting to get more and more consensus about the need to do more climate risk disclosure. What are the risks to these businesses from climate change and climate policy, and how do they need to rethink their business model and our financial system. Things that we maybe didn't like or didn't think was as much in there. So one is trade policy, and we've done a lot of work on trade and climate and that intersection. There's a very small mention within the report around what they call border adjustment fees or tariffs or carbon tariffs, where if we put in a climate policy, that means that it's designed to prevent companies from going offshore and setting up operation over there and just exporting back into the United States. So how do we set up tariffs so that those of us and the industries here are doing the right thing, reducing emissions, and they don't get undercut by imports? That's a good step, but it's really not a comprehensive change in our trade policy. We need to be looking at, and this is what we were calling for, really looking at climate change right at the beginning of trade negotiations and how these things intersect. How do we protect the ability of the United States, but also other countries to implement the Paris Climate Agreement? How do we have space within trade deals to allow them to do that? How do we got to eliminate investor state provisions, which really give corporations, including polluting companies, extra rights and special rights. In many cases, that has been really damaging to the climate, to the environment broadly. And then how do we rethink the World Trade Organization? And that's a big topic of discussion right now because that system is not working very well. How do we, and one of the challenges, trade is hard law. It's legally binding. There's a whole dispute resolution process. Paris is mostly a voluntary kind of peer pressure approach to driving changes in climate. So how do we bring these things together and make sure that the legally binding system doesn't crush the voluntary system? So we would like to have seen a lot more there. And they also shy a little bit away from, we think, tougher regulations. And it's a lot of carrot. There is a little bit of stick, but not enough stick, particularly around fracking. There could be a straight up ban on fracking, and that we continue to see the infrastructure being built out for fracking as well as the export infrastructure. And so they don't sort of take that head on. And for us, while there is an acknowledgement about the challenges of these large scale animal operations in agriculture, there are links to greenhouse gas emissions. There's funding in there to try to help farmers make a transition. There's not more of a direct regulation on that industry. And thinking about how to either reduce emissions with that industry, or we have called for a moratorium on new large-scale CAFOs because we already have enough meat already and dairy, but also to try to deal with this climate issue. So we think they could be a little tougher in some of those areas.
Got it. Tara, is there anything else you want to add in on things that we thought were missing from the report?
That we're missing? Not necessarily. I think there were a couple other small pieces of concern.
Okay.
And a couple of those are, again, minor issues, but mentions of carbon pricing and carbon markets, and then a couple smaller mentions about biogas, both of which are issues we've written a lot about. So I could get into either of those.
Yeah. Do you want to start by telling us a little bit more about how carbon markets were integrated into the proposals?
Yeah, I mean, I'll start with a positive, which is that the report really emphasized that a carbon price is not adequate on its own, and that it would have to be part of a larger suite of policy options in order to really address climate change. And I think that's something we agree with, that if carbon pricing happens, it cannot be the central policy. It just needs to be a little bit of, perhaps even a revenue generator, but absolutely cannot be a central climate policy. So the report did say that, but they did mention carbon pricing. And there was, a small piece in the agriculture section that was exploring quantifying carbon sequestration and looking at ag greenhouse gas reduction efforts. And a lot of that was with an eye on enabling farmers to participate in carbon markets. We did a previous Facebook Live on that, but
Yes.
we're really, opposing using ag emissions reductions as offsets. Largely because offsets let polluters continue polluting. They can, buy up credits and continue business as usual, and really lets companies greenwash their operations. But then also within ag, there are specific considerations about permanency. So carbon sequestration in the soil is not permanent. And then we also don't have reliable or accurate enough measurement tools to guarantee how much carbon is sequestered. So there was, again, looking into better measurement tools and things like that to enable farmer participation in carbon markets that we were concerned about. And then just the general look at carbon pricing too is something that we would want to know more about and would likely oppose, although again, is good that they mentioned that it would just be one piece of climate policy and not the central element.
Definitely. That makes sense. And you also mentioned biogas. How did biogas play into the report?
Yeah, again, starting with that positive, it didn't play a huge role. So that is one thing to mention. But we are against creating biogas from factory farms and then marketing it as renewable energy. And to back up very briefly, to talk about methane digestion, is it's at a CAFO, you can install a methane digester on your manure lagoon, so that a manure lagoon is how waste is generally stored on CAFOs. It's, the waste is liquefied and stored in these giant pools that emit a lot of methane. So a methane digester can eat that up and turn it into biogas, which then is frequently used in transportation fleets, used as a, quote, renewable natural gas. It's not that renewable. It still emits when it is burned and is essentially propping up the CAFO industry by pouring a lot of public money into the construction of digesters. So one part of the report, it sounds like the committee is exploring setting up some type of low carbon fuel standard, which would count biogas as a renewable fuel. So we had concerns around that. And then within the ag section, there was a small part about supporting community scale energy development. And that would be through cooperative methane digesters to help small and mid-scale operations use them. That part, the eye on small and mid-scale operations is good. A digester requires a ton of waste to operate, and so they usually only work for the biggest farms. This would look into using the technology on smaller farms, which we still have concerns about because we want to move away from liquefied manure storage. And so we think there's better ways to use that money in just moving us away from liquid storage to, composting, solid liquid separation, and ultimately, hopefully moving towards pasture-based production. So although it was small, there were a couple mentions of biogas in the report that we would hope to, not support in federal climate policy.
Yes. Yeah. So on the whole, it sounds like there were elements that we really liked and we thought they were moving in the right direction on, and then some issue areas too that were not in full endorsement of. What happens next? So they spent a year developing this report, and I'm assuming that a lot of it depends on how things play out in November. But is there a near-term action plan for how the House plans to move forward on the proposals in the report?
I think that this year there isn't really. There's some other things going on right now that they're prioritizing in Congress, and they know that the Senate is not going to pass any kind of climate legislation this year. Although I would say that report is already informing and should be informing on some of the campaigns. If people did look at the Biden climate plan, there's a lot of elements of this House plan in that Biden climate plan. And it is serving to sort of develop a consensus among people who really want to push for climate action about what some of the priorities are, at least what are the priority areas, and then we can debate the details. But I just think it's a very big step forward, despite some of the concerns we have, because climate policy is challenging. It's a new area, and particularly as it intersects with agriculture, we have to develop new programs and new ways of looking at things and thinking about it, as well as in finance, as well as in trade. And we got to move it forward by putting proposals forward, and let's dissect them and figure out what's right or wrong. And we may have to try some things and see how that goes and then make adjustments. But this really gives, I think, a really good basis for those kinds of debates, discussions, and hopefully next year Congress will be able to pull from parts of this climate plan or put something together that's comprehensive and move something forward.
That's wonderful. I'm glad to end on that positive and hopeful note of the potential of good climate policy, hopefully next year. Tara, do you have anything else to add before we wrap up this conversation? It doesn't look like we have any questions from our followers, so unless you have anything else to add.
I guess just to reiterate something Ben said at the very start, which is that we don't have a federal climate policy. And although this is not legislation, it's the first thing that we have had in terms of a comprehensive look at addressing climate and addressing climate policy. So, overall, really happy that this process has moved forward and looking forward to 2021, hopefully.